Welcome to the Sidewalk Weekly podcast, a show for people who are big on cities but short on time. I'm Vanessa Cork. Eric, did you hear about this so-called no-drama llama who goes to these protests and offers emotional support to folks?
You mean Caesar McCool?
Caesar McCool, the no-drama llama. That's the one.
Caesar McCool is its name. That's the real name. It sounds like Cool Cigarettes' response to Joe Camel's. Was what the name sounds like to me.
Yeah,
Caesar McCool.
But the good version, the positive one, not the one trying to get kids to smoke cigarettes, the one that's trying to get, people to calm down.
Right, the one that gets you calm but doesn't give you cancer. Right.
I also like this story because it introduced me to the word llama activism, which I'd never heard before, which I appreciated as well.
Sometimes the internet really comes through. And hopefully we can come through for you, city lovers. Welcome to the Sidewalk Weekly. I'm Eric Jaffe. We'll spend the next 20 minutes or so discussing the biggest stories from the urban tech world, and we'll talk with author Emily Anthes about her new book, The Great Indoors. When time's up on a segment, you'll hear our little bicycle bell. This week, our top stories look at new data on how COVID is impacting affordability, San Diego's standoff over smart streetlights, and how some cities are taking the lead on reparations.
Okay, let's get started.
All right, let's get into that first story here. It's really a collection of stories, actually, bring together a bunch of new data and trends on the impact that COVID is having on, economic opportunity and affordability in cities across the U.S. Vanessa, this is a really big topic. Where should we start?
Yeah, obviously we could have talked about this topic multiple times over the last few weeks, obviously, but I think this week for us, it's kind of coming to a head, I think. This was the week that unemployment benefits expired for a lot of people. It's also the week that eviction moratoriums ended for many people. So obviously we're at a moment, kind of a peak moment perhaps, where this enormous strain is being put on households, right? And so there was this new piece in the New York Times this week by Emily Badger and Kwok Chung Bui. Hopefully I got that right. And they were putting together some new data showing that the job loss that's happening is disproportionately concentrated in working class neighborhoods. So just to kind of let this data kind of sink in a little bit, they said some of the neighborhoods in New York City and Chicago, in some neighborhoods, the jobless rate was over, 20 or 30%, which is huge. But in the wealthier neighborhoods in the same city, it would be around 10%. And the thing that really hammered it home for me was when they said, parts of the Bronx are experiencing the Great Depression, while the Upper East Side, it's facing modest drops.
Right. You could just have a difference of a mile or two away and a world of difference in the outcomes here. The maps are really striking. I thought it was kind of strange and troubling that the federal government doesn't actually report unemployment at the neighborhood level. This was actually a really original reconstruction of some data by some of the researchers that they talked to in this Upshot piece. The data itself doesn't seem to exist, which is interesting and a little strange.
Right.
Especially given how much we know now about how neighborhood level characteristics have an impact on someone's, outcomes in life.
Yeah.
This is the work of urban economist Raj Chetty. It really matters to know these things.
Yeah, and to that point, in one of the experts that they quote in the piece is an urban planning professor named Ingrid Gold-Ellen of NYU. And she does raise that point. The long-term consequences for children in these areas is significant, right? There's the short-term consequences of things like hunger, but the long-term consequences are also incredibly insignificant. And so there is a lot of urgency right now, especially given the potential for eviction, which again would have tremendous long-term consequences. So the one silver lining is, at least with this kind of data coming out, hopefully cities will be able to deploy services and support their city dwellers in a much more targeted way.
You'd hope so. You'd hope they could get to the neighborhood level type of support that's needed. The other side of the coin here was kind of new data showing a little bit of a rebalancing happening across cities in terms of affordability. So you were talking about within cities disparities, but across cities we've talked about affordability disparities as well, with superstar cities being not affordable and smaller cities still having more affordable rents. Now we're seeing from a blog called Wolf Street, the script is kind of flipping here, and you've got superstar cities with rents plummeting. San Francisco rents down 11% year over year. These are obviously relative changes. The rents in San Francisco are still very high, but relatively a huge drop. And then cities that had been more affordable before the pandemic, places like Cleveland, St. Louis, Detroit, Nashville, they're all up double digits into the teens in terms of rent rises.
Right. And this brings up a trend that we've definitely talked about before on the show in terms of people who have the ability to work remotely, taking the opportunity to leave more expensive cities and find housing in more affordable cities. And so this trend could kind of go two ways, right? On the one hand, it could be good for these traditionally more affordable cities because you could spark the local economy. You could create new jobs. There could be more like an innovation economy kind of being stimulated. On the other hand, if the rents start getting too high, these cities are going to start facing the same affordability issues that we've been seeing in the larger cities. These cities have to be really proactive here and start to make sure there's enough market housing to keep up with the demand and enough government support for low-income housing as well.
Yeah, and I know we're running short on time here, but we did want to mention one more piece from Derek Thompson in The Atlantic, who's writing about kind of all the ways teleworking could change the economy at a macro scale and lead to things like an exodus of populations from superstar cities. We don't know which way that'll go, but it could happen and accelerate.
Yeah, and one reason why I liked that Thompson piece too was that he was very straightforward about my predictions could very well be wrong, like whenever you get into the prediction game. And so he actually offers counterexamples for each of his predictions. So he also says that, it is plausible that companies end up bringing people back into the office and into these big cities once they learn that, remote collaboration may not be quite as productive as they thought it would be.
Present company excluded.
Yeah. We're clearly, exceptions to the rule. All right, our next story comes from Sarah Holder of Bloomberg City Lab, and she is writing about San Diego and their smart street lamps that were supposed to gather traffic data, but have started gathering police footage, and that has caused lawmakers and community members to push back. Eric, can you explain what's going on in San Diego?
Yeah, so Sarah Holder is reporting that San Diego launched a smart streetlight program back in 2016. Within a couple years, the city had something like 3,200 streetlight sensors across the city. These were supposed to do things like collect air quality data, collect kind of foot traffic data at a very granular level. This can be really helpful information for local populations, in terms of asthma risk, in terms of foot traffic for small businesses. But these street sensors also had video capabilities, which meant that public safety and the potential use by police was always kind of lingering in the background. And recently, the police in San Diego have been relying on these cameras a great deal.
Yeah, I think Sarah Holder writes that the police have used this footage about 400 times, and not just for violent crimes, but also for things, like vandalism, which is actually a violation of the department's own mandate around, usage of this footage.
Yeah, and so that's a big part of the problem here, and it's prompted a couple new rule proposals in San Diego. These are just proposals for now. One is that the city council should have an approval process before adopting these new technologies and make kind of reporting guidelines for the data and the usage very clear and transparent.
Yeah.
But the second, kind of more interesting, I think, is this idea of a privacy advisory commission. They're calling it a PAC. It's made up of lawyers, privacy experts, but really community members, not politicians or elected officials, who can evaluate the civil liberties and the potential risks and benefits of digital projects in the public space.
And I think that commission is a really great move from San Diego and definitely was inspired by a similar effort that happened in Oakland, California, which we actually spoke about on the very first episode of the Sidewalk Weekly, if you recall.
That's right, in the before time.
Yeah, BC, when things are simpler. So in Oakland, the system worked pretty well. I mean, there's still plenty of technology that does get deployed and that has benefits and helps community members, but the community members still get to guide the purpose of the technology and the use of it. So, for example, traffic-related data in Oakland cannot be shared with immigration enforcement.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think there were a couple things in this story about San Diego that are worth unpacking a bit further. And the first was the really expansive, almost limitless purposes that the streetlight technology was allowed to pursue, right? This is not the best practice anymore. You need to have a very clear, a very narrow purpose for why you are using a certain technology that can collect data in public spaces. Otherwise, you create a situation where you're just collecting data for data's sake, and you don't have kind of clear limitations on how it can be used, which gets into things like the police starting to use it in ways that were not originally approved and conceived of.
Right.
So that's one of them. The other one is this notion of data minimization. And that is something that we practice at Sidewalk. And it's also a critical element of privacy by design principles, which are kind of the global best practice in how to design technologies. And the idea there is that you shouldn't build a tool, you should not design a tool that is capable of capturing more data than it needs to accomplish its purpose, right? So in this case, if your purpose is air quality detection, there is no need to have a video component to that sensor. It should be a totally anonymous sensor collecting only non-personal information.
Right. When it comes to the use of data in a city, you should be very mindful and you should evaluate, what is the outcome that we wish to achieve? If it's lower pollution in our air, then why on earth would you be looking for a video footage solution there? You could have a probably cheaper and also kind of a technology solution of a sensor, right? That doesn't need to know who or what you are, what you're doing. I think that though that San Diego's really going in the right direction with this commission because those are the kinds of questions that can go to that commission and people can think about it and hopefully kind of push the technology in the right direction. And I guess I'll end with a quote from a council member here. I do think that there's a major function for technology. I just think that it moves fast and we give up so much in the process. And I think what they're doing in San Diego is kind of showing how to slow down that process, how to put in safeguards to get the benefits of tech without, sacrificing privacy or agency.
That's the goal. All right, our final top story comes from Dacia Moore, who's writing in the Boston Globe. And Dacia is writing about how some cities, including Providence, are seriously considering reparations for injustices against Black Americans. Vanessa, walk us through this important topic and how it might actually work.
Sure thing. So Dacia focuses, as you said, on Providence, where Mayor Jorge Elorza really wants to make a serious push around studying and potentially implementing reparations. In the piece, they talk about the fact that Providence has a really long history of racial injustice going back to colonial days. And so, it seems pretty intuitive that, cities would step up and try to address this issue in their communities. But the piece also brings up that there are scholars who just feel that it's really the national government's responsibility to take this action because of the sweeping scope of the injustices, right? And it also goes to kind of a numbers perspective, actually. So there was a calculation in the piece that closing the racial wealth gap, which is one way you could totally approach reparations.
One way, yeah.
That would cost $10 to $12 trillion. And all the city and state budgets in the U.S. combined only reach $3 trillion. So I think these scholars are trying to say, as much as cities want to try and help, it really should involve federal action and federal money.
Right. You couldn't close that gap otherwise.
Right.
I think, it is important to kind of note here that a lot of the motivation for cities exploring the idea of reparations and potentially paying reparations, it doesn't always or necessarily have to go back to colonial times and slavery. It does in the case of Providence and some cities, but there have been plenty of 20th century impacts in northern cities, right? Not just southern cities, such as redlining, such as urban renewal, that severely impacted economic opportunity for Black Americans, and that should be studied as well. So there is a whole history here. Stretching up to the present day.
That's right. And cities are recognizing that fact, right? And starting to act on it. For example, Asheville, North Carolina recently voted to fund more housing programs in majority Black neighborhoods. And that was their attempt to kind of reset some of the discrimination that's happened in housing over the last few decades. That said, there was another scholar quoted in the piece, a Duke scholar named William A. Darity Jr., who said that, efforts like equitably distributing housing opportunities, super important, but you really shouldn't call them reparations because isn't that just what a city should be doing anyway as part of its core civic responsibility? And I think that's a really excellent point and brings up the fact that, the how of reparations is actually kind of tricky. How do you execute it on it, even if you can get consensus that it's the right thing to do?
Yeah, and that how part is where another story you found this week is perhaps even more instructive, right? It's written by Rosanna Shia, writing in the LA Times about the case of Manhattan Beach, which is in Los Angeles, and there's a part of Manhattan Beach called Bruce's Beach, and it's given that name because the Bruce family, which was an African-American family, settled there in the early 1900s. They turned it into a really thriving African-American community for a while, until neighboring white communities, taking some really hostile, aggressive measures, effectively drove that community away. And ultimately, city officials even condemned some of the area and used eminent domain to turn it into a park.
Right. And what's happened today then is that the land that park is on is worth $75 million, right?
A
lot. And so now in the community, there's an active discussion happening and even a campaign, a petition to give back the land. It has 9,500 signatures. It seeks restitution for 95 years of damages and all that land wealth that could never be recovered for the Bruce family. That said, that's not the only way to go about it. Some members of the community say, maybe that the restitution to the family isn't necessarily the right course. Maybe the land could become a historical center. Maybe the value could be used to create a scholarship foundation. And so basically, I think what this story shows us is that even if the community can get consensus around the need for reparations, the how to execute it is actually up for a lot of debate and conversation. So it'll be interesting to see how cities tackle this issue.
Yeah, but encouraging to see that they are starting to tackle it. So.
Definitely. That is it for the top stories this week. As always, you can find the links to these stories in the podcast episode notes. Up next, we're going to talk with author Emily Anthes about all the ways building design and architecture shape our lives. Back in a sec. We are now joined by journalist Emily Anthes, who just published a book called The Great Indoors, The Surprising Science of How Buildings Shape Our Behavior, Health, and Happiness. Emily, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Emily, really great to have you on. When we think about cities and architecture, we usually think about kind of the exterior building shape, the aesthetics of that, public spaces. Why do you think we haven't paid more attention to the ways the inside of buildings influence our lives?
I do have a couple of theories. One of them is I think a big part is just the familiarity, especially when it comes to our homes and offices. We just spend so much time there that we don't really ever step back and think about how they're affecting us. I know I'm guilty of that myself. And until I started writing this book, I never thought that critically about my home. And I guess the other piece of it is, the insides of buildings are often privately owned and occupied. And there, isn't as much data being collected about these environments as there is about, traffic patterns and weather patterns. And so it's just sort of, I think, harder to get an objective look at these spaces.
So the timing of this book is pretty impeccable, Emily. I mean, you write in your introduction, I am unapologetically indoorsy. And now, in this COVID era, we are all indoorsy, whether we want to be or not.
Maybe more apologetically.
Yeah, exactly. So how do you think that this pandemic will change the way that we design interior spaces or even just relate to our interior spaces?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple different trends that we may see accelerating at sort of both the micro and macro level. One of them is, I think, we'll see an increasing attention being paid to indoor air quality, which was already starting to happen, but is, now I think especially important, both because of COVID risk, but also the more time we spend indoors, the more we are exposed to our indoor air. And so the quality suddenly really matters. I think we'll see other sort of small trends like that accelerate, like the move towards sort of more high-tech and no-touch spaces and surfaces. So, smart controls or adjusting the indoor environment via phone. And then sort of on a larger scale, I think we'll see a bit of a, maybe a well-deserved backlash to sort of our obsession with open plan everything.
Yeah, let's unpack that a little bit more here. Can you kind of talk about some ways that office data has started to reveal insights about how we can change or improve workplace design?
Yeah, absolutely. So we now have the technology to have sensors and other types of measurement tools, actually embedded in our built environments and in our buildings. And so they are revealing ways that we are actually using offices, not just theory about how a space might look or work, but how do people actually interact in these spaces? So, to take an example from WeWork, they have literally millions of pieces of data on how its members use their meeting rooms. And to give just one example of what they learned, initially they thought that meeting rooms were basically conference rooms and they needed big tables for 10 to 12 people and whiteboards and projectors. And when they actually looked at the data, they found that most meetings actually just had 2 to 3 people. They weren't using any of this high-tech equipment. And so that sort of prompted them to even reconceptualize these spaces. They were calling them conference rooms. They changed it to meeting rooms. They sort of created smaller spaces with, dimmer lighting and more comfortable sort of lounge-like seating. So more conversational spaces.
In another one of your chapters, you bring up the ways that, building technologies can help seniors remain healthy in their homes. That is obviously a really big issue as we think about the future of cities. So can you talk about some of the technologies that you kind of came across in your research?
Yeah, I think one of the most promising applications, and one that's also I think achievable and not just, a utopian pipe dream, is the idea of fall detection. And there are a lot of different approaches to it, from pressure sensors that are installed under the floorboards themselves to depth sensing cameras that can be mounted in a room and sort of track when a human silhouette takes a tumble. But the idea is that, a lot of older people end up living alone. And if they fall, it can sometimes be hours before they're found or able to get help. And we know that the longer it takes for them to get treatment, the worse their outcomes are. So the idea is if you had a system like this, you could alert a caregiver or a next of kin or call an ambulance. And so you wouldn't have someone just lying on the floor, unable to reach help for hours and hours. So I think that's sort of a good example of the promise that this kind of technology can have.
Last one for you, Emily, and we'll let you go. There's obviously this tension throughout this book between the need to kind of collect more data to get insights like when someone falls, and the need to protect people's privacy and have them feel comfortable in their own interior spaces. Where do you land in terms of how we can go about evaluating the risk-benefit of this type of data?
Yeah, those are really tricky issues and trade-offs, and there's not an easy answer to it. I think I would encourage people to evaluate each technology and system and application on a case-by-case basis because there's no one answer. But I think one useful guideline, which is something that a source told me, is that we need to make sure that the technology serves us and serves humans, and not that we are serving the technology. And so what that means sort of in practice is that users should remain in control of the system, of their data. We should be able to determine, our own privacy and data sharing settings. We should be able to override or turn off the system at any time or for any reason. I think really giving the end user control over those things is one way to start to minimize some of those risks.
That sounds right to me. Thank you so much, Emily.
Thank you, Emily.
Thanks for having me.
It is now time for our final segment, The Last Smile. In this segment, we set aside the depressing news and we focus on something happy for a minute each. Eric, what made you smile this week?
So my real last smile this week was a Wire story with the headline, "Detained drug smuggling cat escapes from Sri Lankan prison."
Okay.
I'll just let the listener's imagination go from there. But that wasn't deemed urban tech enough to count as a last smile. So I will go with my backup choice, which is a New York Times story by Lisa Prevost about how cleaning robots are having a moment in commercial real estate. So there's a bunch of companies entering this space, trying to create robots that can, deploy disinfectants, clean bathrooms, clean floors, get the commercial real estate in your city ready for occupancy potentially, and hopefully this fall. One of them's named Neo. It's a 1,000-pound robot floor scrubber, and for $50,000, Vanessa, it can be yours.
Oh, for the cheap price of $50,000. Would you put a Neo in your apartment?
You'd have a really clean floor, so.
So it would be worth it.
What had you smiling?
Well, there was a really fun quartz obsession this week. I've put a lot of these in the newsletters in the past. I really enjoyed this vertical from Quartz. It's basically they just dive deep into one subject for one really long email. And this week it was on hairdressers, which is, I know usually the thing that brings you joy and
Creeping on my beat here.
Yeah, exactly. But the history of hairdressers was quite interesting, actually. They quote British scholar Sean Williams, who wrote a whole cultural history of hairdressers, explaining that they emerged in the 18th century as a middle-class service. But he also says it was an urban phenomenon. And he writes, a person from the country or the villages will come into the city and be astounded. The hairdressers worked 7 days a week. So clearly there was a lot of demand for it in this new urban society, which I found quite interesting. And there was also a fun little timeline of Madam C.J. Walker and her rise to fame. So all around, very fun little historical dive into hairdressing.
Take care of your hair, folks. Time is up. Thanks for joining us this week.
If you want to read the stories we discussed today and many more, then sign up for the Sidewalk Weekly newsletter at sidewalklabs.com.
We should note that the views expressed in the Sidewalk Weekly don't necessarily reflect Sidewalk's company position.
And if you think we're missing a perspective, then let us know. Send an email or voice memo to podcast@sidewalklabs.com, and we might just talk about it in a future episode.
The Sidewalk Weekly is produced by Vanessa and me. This episode was edited by Zach McNeese. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions, and our art is by the great Tim Cow. We'll see you next time.
Bye.